Top 10 Tortures Worse Than Death. Since the dawn of time, the human mind could devise innovative and horrifying methods of retribution for alleged transgressors, villains, witches, and anybody else who had the misfortune of being in the incorrect location at the incorrect moment. The tried and true methods of execution, such as stoning, hanging, and burning, are well known to all of us. What happens if you are treated unfairly by another person? Additionally, there are a few that have not yet left the building. Watch this video all the way through because it focuses solely on these 10 horrifying forms of torture. However, we strongly advise against replicating them at home. Number 10. Upright Jerker. A fascinating new take on a time-honored way of putting criminals to death was the upright jerker. The use of hanging as a form of capital punishment, despite being a tried and tested practice in every region of the world, leaves much to be desired in terms of its efficiency. It can be a very slow or awkward method to die, depending on the weight of the victim, the rope, the trap door, and a wide variety of other conditions. What about the obvious answer? Turn it around and try it. The upright jerker was a modified hanging device that utilized large weights and pulleys to quickly jerk the condemned into the air. This system was also known as the upright jerker. It was thought that this would be a more efficient method of breaking the neck in a short amount of time. Nevertheless, it did not always operate as planned. Number 9. Ling Chi. Ling Chi was a form of excruciating execution that was common in China. It was also known as slow slicing or death by 1,000 cuts. The condemned person was typically beheaded or had a final cut made to their heart before they were left hanging from a pole while their skin and limbs were gradually severed one at a time. Beginning in the 10th century, people have been making use of it, and this practice has persisted for about 1,000 years. 1905 was the year that it was finally outlawed, thank goodness. Number 8. Blood Eagle. The Nordic legends that tell of Viking killings are the source of the blood eagle. The back of the condemned person was sliced open to gain access to the ribs, which were subsequently fractured and twisted into an upright position to resemble wings. Salt was poured into the wound to make matters even worse for the victim. And as a finishing touch, the lungs were removed from the body and draped for dramatic effect over the rib wings. There is, thank goodness, ongoing discussion as to whether or not this method was ever put into operation or whether it is only the stuff of folklore. In either case, the fact that somebody had the time to conceive of this is quite unsettling. Number 7. Keel hauling. Keel hauling was a form of corporal punishment that was developed in the late 16th century by the Dutch Navy to specifically target sailors. The perpetrators of the crime were cuffed with rope and dragged through the water from one end of the ship to the other. Even though many people drowned or suffered internal injuries as a result of the technique, it was not always intended to be lethal one all the time. Men who were punished by keel hauling frequently had their skin torn off by the barnacles that grew on the keel of the ship, and they carried the scars with them for the rest of their lives. This was an added perk if they were to have survived, that is. Number 6. Boiling. Shellfish are the only modern-day victims of the cruel practice of live boiling. However, many years ago, this practice was widely used as a kind of capital punishment everywhere from East Asia to England. The condemned person was disrobed before being thrown into a vat or pot filled with a boiling liquid, which was typically either water, oil, or tar. The criminal could also be submerged in cold liquid before the liquid is brought to a boil to provide a more horrible experience. According to records that date back to the reign of Henry VIII, some individuals were put in a pot of boiling water for as long as 2 hours before they passed away. Number 5. Torture of rats. The concept of torturing rats appears to be alive and well in the thoughts of those who are creative, since it was recently utilized in the movie Too Fast, Too Furious, as well as in the television series Game of Thrones. The victim is made to lie on their stomach or chest naked, while a hungry and/or ill rat is placed in a bucket on top of them. This horrifying method of torture is admittedly rather inventive. The bucket is then heated from the outside, and the agitated rat begins to gnaw its way through the poor person's body, as well as any organs it occurs to come across while making its way out. Number 4. Execution vans. China has developed frighteningly effective methods for carrying out the death penalty. The fact that China is the country that carries out the most executions every year of any nation in the world should not come as much of a surprise. Fraud against the government, starting fires intentionally, and prostitution are examples of the kind of offenses that can result in the death penalty. The majority of executions in China are now carried out within mobile execution units, which are essentially vans that are stocked with the appropriate chemicals and restraints for carrying out lethal injections. Since roughly 10 years ago, the vans, which have the appearance of regular police vehicles, have been driving around. There are dozens of them dispensing lethal punishment throughout the country, and they can be found near the sites of crimes. Number 3. Drawing and dividing into quarters. One of the most notorious forms of cruel and unusual punishment is the practice of drawing and quartering the victim. It is still hard to accept that it is a real phenomenon that was created by real people, and that it occurred to real people who were unlucky in some way. In the 13th century, punishment was initially imposed in England for the first time. After being hauled, or chained to a horse and dragged to the gallows, the guilty were typically hanged, and in some cases, they were also disemboweled or beheaded. The condemned person was then quartered, which means that his body was cut into 4 sections. This was often accomplished by tying each limb to a separate horse and making them gallop in opposing directions. This particular form of punishment was designated for people who were found guilty of treason and was done away with in the year 1867. Number 2. Strappado. The strappado is a painful method of torture that, in contrast to a good number of the others on this list, does not necessarily result in the victim's death. In the punishment known as strappado, the person who is considered guilty is hung from the neck down by the wrists. If the painful dislocation of the shoulders is not caused by the awkward position, then adding weights is an option. However, the likelihood of this happening is quite low. Strappado is a game that has been played far into the 21st century, despite the widespread belief that its roots lie in the Inquisition of the Middle Ages. Number 1. White torture. Although the phrase white torture can be used to refer to any form of psychological suffering in general, the meaning of the phrase in this context is more literal. White torture is a form of sensory deprivation in which a prisoner's whole environment, including their cell, their clothing, and even their food, is bleached white. White uniforms are worn by the security personnel, the lights are left on around the clock, and no one is allowed to speak. There is no visible color. The instance of Amir Fakhravar, who was arrested in his home country of Iran and subjected to white torture for almost 8 months in 2004, provided evidence of this practice. The psychological harm caused by sensory deprivation is incomparable to anything else on this list, even though the physical agony caused by it is rather mild in comparison to the other forms of torture on this list. According to what Fakhravar was quoted as saying after his release, he was no longer a normal person and could not even remember the faces of his parents. So, do you like this video? Give your answer in comments section below, and don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more videos.